welcome to another edition of Traveling Through History. Really glad you're here this evening. Tonight, we'd like to talk to you about the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the most fascinating and most amazing finds of the 20th century, and really probably in the top 5 greatest archaeological finds of human history. The reason that is because these ancient scrolls and ancient texts that were found accidentally in 1947 and in the years following were the books and texts coming from the ancient Old Testament and Jewish Bible at the time, from a group that lived in the Qumran area. Qumran is in Jordan, right near the Dead Sea, and it's a place where there was a small village and a small group of individuals who ended up getting pushed out of that area. But before they did, they set up what was in effect a rudimentary library with thousands of texts that they put in clay pots and different encasings to try to protect them in what was this rudimentary library. And what ended up happening, of course, in 1947, many centuries later, was a boy stumbled upon them and then let a bunch of other people know. And then, of course, archaeologists got very interested, and historians came to find that these Dead Seas were found in 11 different caves in the Qumran area of Jordan. And of course, the interest just grew and grew and grew as they found more and more texts and started to piece the fragments of these old documents together. The unique atmosphere of the area there, being very dry, being a desert, being near the Dead Sea, the cave enclosures that they were in, and of course being in clay pots to protect them, gave the Dead Sea Scrolls a chance over history to actually be preserved. In most cases, documents this old would never have been preserved and wouldn't be legible. So it really was kind of an incredible situation that these documents were able to be preserved over the many centuries. And then, of course, accidentally found by the boy who stumbled upon them, and then, of course, the historians who came to preserve them. Since 1947, these scrolls have been analyzed, pieced back together, scanned, computerized, translated, and many of the books now, the historians have come to understand what they say, what they mean. They've been separated out into the original order and intent. And some of the books actually were original biblical texts and original books of the Old Testament. And some of them were actually completely new texts and completely new books that had never been read before by Jews or Christians alike. And so really the study of these scrolls is a fascinating thing we still do today. We're still trying to grapple with all of the things we learned from these documents and are still learning from these documents about what the old Jews and the old Christians believed, and what the general kind of thought process was for the people in that area around the birth of Christ, both before and after. So we're going to go ahead and talk to you a little bit about the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're going to watch a video, and we'll talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls after the video on the other side, and some of the big revelations that came out of that video. Let's go ahead and talk about the history. So the Dead Sea Scrolls refer to ancient Hebrew scrolls that were accidentally discovered in 1947 by a Bedouin boy in the Judean desert, on display today in the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The scrolls have kindled popular enthusiasm as well as serious scholarly interest over the past half-century, as they reveal exciting history from the Second Temple period, which was 520 BC to 70 CE, a time of crucial developments in the crystallization of monotheistic religions, both Judaism and Christianity. The Judean desert, a region that was very barren and defied preconceptions and yielded an unprecedented treasure in these Dead Sea Scrolls. The young shepherd was certainly unaware of destiny when his innocent search for a stray goat led to a fateful discovery of Hebrew scrolls preserved in jars in long untouched cave. One discovery led to another, and 11 scroll-yielding caves and a habitation site eventually were uncovered. Since 1947, the site of these discoveries, the Qumran region, the desert plain and the adjoining mountainous ridge, and the Qumran habitation site have been subjected to countless probes. Not a stone has remained unturned in the desert, not an aperture unprobed. The Qumran settlement has been exhaustively excavated to this point. The first trove found by the Bedouins in the Judean desert consisted of 7 large scrolls from Cave 1. The unusual circumstances of the find on the eve of Israel's War of Independence obstructed the initial negotiations for the purchase of all the scrolls. Shortly before the establishment of the State of Israel, Professor Sukenik of the Hebrew University clandestinely acquired 3 of the scrolls from a Christian Arab antiquities dealer in Bethlehem. The remaining 4 scrolls reached the hands of Mar Athenius Samuel, the Metropolitan of Syrian Jacobite ministry of St. Mark in Jerusalem. In 1949, he traveled to the United States with the scrolls, but 5 years went by before the prelate found a purchaser. On June 1st, 1954, 5 years later, Mar Samuel placed an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal offering 4 Dead Sea Scrolls for sale. The advertisement was brought to the attention of Yigal Yadkin, who was Professor Sudenek's son, who had just retired as Chief of Staff of the Israel Defense Forces and had reverted to his primary vocation, archaeology. With the aid of intermediaries, the 4 scrolls were purchased from Mar Samuel for $250,000 at the time, 1954. Thus, the scrolls that had eluded Yadkin's father because of the war were now at his disposal. Part of the purchase price was contributed by D.S. Gottesman, a New York philanthropist. His heirs sponsored construction of the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem's Israel Museum, in which these unique manuscripts are exhibited to the public. The 7 scrolls from Cave 1, now housed together in the Shrine of the Book, are Isaiah A, Isaiah B, the Habakkuk Commentary, the Thanksgiving Scroll, the Community Rule, the War Rule, and the Genesis Apocryphon, the last being in Aramaic. All the large scrolls have now been published electronically, and there have been copies been made as well. Thanks to modern technological advances, scientists and archaeologists have been able to piece together tiny separate fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls and reconstruct damaged parts via computer imaging. Scientists in September 2016 completed the virtual unwrapping of a badly damaged ancient piece of parchment and found it to contain parts of the book of Leviticus. In January 2018, researchers announced that they had completed piecing together 60 parchment fragments and deciphered one of the last remaining and most obscure portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The tiny fragments, once pieced together and translated, revealed the word tekopha, or festival, marking a change in seasons. The same word in modern-day Hebrew means period. At least a year elapsed between discovery of the scrolls in 1947 and the initiation of a systematic archaeological investigation of the Qumran site. The northern Dead Sea, the location of Qumran, became and remained part of Jordan until 1967, now, of course, part of Israel. The search for the scroll material rested in the hands of Bedouins who ravaged the Cave 1 site, no doubt losing precious material in the process. It's really a shame if you think about it. A lot of care was given to this excavation in the beginning, but as time wore on, more and more people were coming, and there were obviously some huge treasures lost because the material was not being treated correctly. Early in 1949, the cave site was finally identified by the archaeological authorities of Jordan G. Lancaster Harding, director of the Jordanian Antiquities Department, who undertook to excavate Cave 1 with Père Roland, a French Dominican priest, who headed the École Biblique in Jerusalem. Exploration of the cave, which lay 1 kilometer north of Wadi Qumran, yielded at least 70 fragments, including bits of the original 7 scrolls. The discovery established the provenance of purchased scrolls. Also recovered were archaeological artifacts that confirmed the scroll dates suggested by paleontological study. The Bedouins continued to search for scrolls as these scraps of leather proved to be fine source of income. Because Cave 1 had been exhausted by archaeological excavation, The fresh material that the Bedouins were offering proved that Cave 1 was not an isolated phenomenon in the desert, and that other caves with manuscripts also existed. In the years between 1951 and 1956, they were marked by accelerated activity in both the search of the caves and the archaeological excavation of sites related to tile manuscripts. An 8-kilometer-long strip of cliffs was thoroughly investigated. Of the 11 caves that yielded manuscripts, 5 were discovered by the Bedouins and 6 by archaeologists. Some of the caves were particularly rich in material. Cave 3 preserved 2 oxidized rolls of beaten copper, containing a lengthy roster of real and imaginary hidden treasures, which was a tantalizing enigma to this day of what they mean. Cave 4 was particularly rich in material. 15,000 fragments from at least 600 different composite texts were found there in that cave. The last manuscript cave discovered, Cave 2, was located in 1956, providing extensive documents, including the Psalm Scroll, which is an Aramaic Targum of Job, and the Temple Scroll, the longest, which had about 29 feet of scroll length of the Qumran scripts. The Temple Scroll was acquired by Yigal Yadin in 1967 and is now housed alongside the first 7 scrolls in the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. All the remaining manuscripts, sizable texts as well as minute fragments, are stored at the Rockefeller Museum building in Jerusalem, the premises of the Israel Antiquities Authority. The ruins of Qumran lie on a barren terrace between limestone cliffs in the Judean desert and the maritime bed along Dead Sea. The excavations uncovered a complex of structures, 262 by 325 feet, preserved to a considerable height. The structures were neither military nor private, but rather communal in nature. Nearby were remains of burials. Pottery uncovered was identical to that of Cave 1 and confirmed the link with the nearby caves. Following the initial excavations, Duval suggested that this site was the wilderness retreat established by the Essene sect, which was alluded to by ancient historians. The sectarians inhabited neighboring locations, most likely caves, tents, and solid structures, but depended on the center for communal facilities such as stores of food and water. Excavations conducted in 1956 and 1958 at the neighboring site proved it to be one of the agricultural adjuncts of Qumran. The final report on Qumran settlement excavations is still pending even today, but the results are known through preliminary publications. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls caused heated controversy in scholarly circles over their date and their identity of the community that they represented. After initially defining the time span of the scrolls as the Second Temple period, recognized their special significance and advocated the now widely accepted theory that they were remnants of a library of the Essenes. At the time, however, this theory was ferociously opposed by several scholars who doubted that the antiquity as well as authenticity of the texts even existed. Lingering in the memory of learned circles was the notorious Sapphira affair of 1883. A Jerusalem antiquities dealer announced the discovery of an ancient text of Deuteronomy. His text, allegedly inscribed on 15 leather strips, caused a huge stir in Europe and were even exhibited at the British Museum. Shortly thereafter, leading European scholars of the day denounced the writings as rank forgeries. Today's scholarly opinion regarding the time span and background of the Dead Sea Scrolls is anchored in historical, paleographic, and linguistic evidence, corroborated firmly by carbon-14 datings. Some manuscripts were written and copied in the 3rd century BC, but the bulk of the material, particularly texts that reflect on a sectarian community, are originals or copies from the 1st century BC. A number of texts date from as late as the years preceding the destruction of the site in 68 CE at the hands of the Roman legions. In terms of the Essenes, who were the people living in this area until they got pushed out, The Qumran sect's origins were postulated by some scholars to be in the communities of the Hasidim, the pious anti-Hellenistic circles formed in the early days of Maccabees. The Hasidim may have been precursors of the Essenes, who were concerned about growing Hellenization and strove to abide by the Torah. Archaeological and historical evidence indicates that the Qumran was founded in the second half of the 2nd century BC during the time of the Maccabean dynasty. A hiatus in the occupation of this site is linked to the evidence of huge earthquakes. Qumran was abandoned about the time of the Roman incursion of 68 CE, 2 years after the collapse of the Jewish self-government in Judea and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE. The chief sources of information for this history of this fateful time are Qumran scrolls and excavations, but earlier information on the Essenes was provided by their contemporaries, Joseus Flavius, Philo of Alexandria, and Pliny the Elder. The accounts are continuously being borne out by the site excavations and study of the writings. So all the studies and excavations, texts, and even accounts from the time of different tribes around the Essenes all confirmed their existence, the timing of their existence, and a little bit about their culture that could have produced such scrolls. The historian Josephus relates the division of the Jews of the Second Temple period into 3 orders. You have the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. The Sadducees included mainly the priestly and aristocratic families. The Pharisees constituted the J circles, and the Essenes were the separatist group, part of which formed as an ascetic monastic community that retreated to the wilderness. The exact political and religious affinities of each of these groups, as well as their development and interrelationships, are still relatively obscure and unknown. The crisis that brought about the secession of the Essenes from mainstream Judaism is thought to have occurred when the Maccabean ruling princes, Jonathan and Simeon, usurped the office of high priest. Much to the consternation of conservative Jews, some of them could not tolerate the situation and denounced the new rulers. The persecution of the Essenes and their leader, the teacher of righteousness, probably elicited the sect's apocalyptic visions, which they wrote about quite often. They included the overthrow of the wicked priest of Jerusalem and of the evil people, and the dawn of the Messianic age. The recognition of the community as true Israel. The retreat of these Jews into the desert would enable them to separate themselves from the congregation of perverse men. A significant feature of the Essene sect is its calendar, which was based on a solar system of 364 days, unlike our calendar of 365. This was based on a lunar calendar that they had been tracking for many centuries. The sectarian calendar was always reckoned from a Wednesday to a Tuesday, the day on which God created luminaries. The year consisted of 52 weeks divided into 4 seasons of 13 weeks each, and the festivals consistently fell on the same days of the week. The Essenes persisted in a separatist existence through 2 centuries, occupying themselves with study and a communal way of life that included worship, prayer, and work. It is clear, however, the large groups of adherents who lived in towns and villages outside the Qumran area eventually fled for different political reasons. So that's why this whole area eventually ended up getting abandoned, and all the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, were left in their library that they had established. In terms of the Qumran library and its environs, they have been restored as much as possible by the Jewish documentarians. These documents are dating back now to the 3rd century BC, all the way to 68 CE. So they have documents that stretch across 400 years total. They demonstrate the rich literary activity of the Second Temple period in Judaism. The collection comprises documents of a varied nature. Most of them are distinct religious texts. The chief categories represented are biblical and sectarian writings. The study of this original library has demonstrated that the boundaries between these categories is far from clear-cut. The biblical manuscripts include what are probably the earliest copies of these texts to ever come upon us. Most of the books of the Bible are represented in this collection. Some books are extant in large number of copies, others are represented only fragmentarily in mere scraps of parchment. The biblical texts display considerable similarity to the standard received text that we know as the Old Testament. This, however, was not always the rule, as many texts diverge from the messianic principles. For example, some of the texts of Samuel from K4 follow the Greek version of the Bible translated into the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. Qumran has yielded copies of this Greek version of the Bible as well. The biblical scrolls in general have provided many new readings that facilitate the reconstruction of the textual history of the Old Testament. It is also significant that several manuscripts of the Bible, including the Leviticus scroll, are inscribed not in the Jewish script dominant at the time, but rather in ancient Paleo-Hebrew script. A considerable number of the texts were preserved at Qumran were original Hebrew and Aramaic versions of these Jewish compositions. These writings, which were not included in the canonical Jewish scriptures, were preserved by different Christian churches and were transmitted in Greek, Ethiopian, Syriac, Armenian, and other translations. So pretty incredible. They actually found manuscripts there in as many as 10 languages. So over the 400 years, you can imagine all the different scrolls and documents that they had been gathering into that library. So why are the Dead Sea Scrolls important? The scroll's discovery is remarkable on several counts. First, it is quite unusual for ancient scrolls, usually written on parchment or papyrus, to be preserved in an archaeological record. The organic nature of such writing materials causes them to decompose rapidly. Yet the arid environment of the Judean desert allowed these texts to survive. After more than 2 millennia, they're still legible. They illuminate the Bible's composition. Prior to their discovery, the earliest surviving copies of the Hebrew Bible dated to around 1000 CE. The scrolls are a millennium earlier than that. Scholars are able to see continuity between the scrolls and later biblical manuscripts. Yet they also have found some variations. For example, some scrolls of Exodus and Samuel from Qumran preserve passages that were absent from later biblical manuscripts and are not actually in the Old Testament. So you had mostly Old Testament books, but you had some new ones that they discovered. These might represent different traditions that were circulating at the time of the scroll's writing. The Dead Sea Scrolls are thus instrumental in reconstructing biblical texts and biblical history. They provide a window into the world of their authors. The scrolls did not just rewrite the history of the Hebrew Bible's development, they rewrote the history of Judea in the late Second Temple period. Most of these texts were written when the Second Temple still stood in Jerusalem, when Jewish sects, including Pharisees and Sadducees, argued that the correct interpretation of the law, and when the Greeks and Romans, with Herod as client king, ruled over the region. A few other texts date as far back as the 8th century BC, during the time of the First Temple, while some are as late as Islamic conquest of the region in the 7th century CE. In terms of who actually wrote them and their author's identity, many connect them with the Essene community, another Jewish sect who lived in Qumran. The scrolls then would have been their library, essentially. And we talked about that a little earlier in the program. The environment around Qumran is arid, although it is more fertile in antiquity than today. It still would not have been the most comfortable place to live, yet it was well suited for the Essenes, who sought to remove themselves from society to live a pure and righteous life in accordance with a strict interpretation of Jewish law. One of the documents uncovered among the scrolls, the community roll, gives some insight into life for the Qumran community, if indeed they were the authors of the scrolls. We see from other texts that this group was anticipating several major events like end of days. They believed that the promised Messiah would soon return, overthrow a corrupt society, and usher in the kingdom of God. The scrolls help us recreate this historical moment. We learn from the varied religious landscape of Judaism during this period, from which emerged early Christianity. For it is during this time in the 1st century CE, the 1st century of the Dead Sea Scrolls composition, that Jesus of Nazareth launched his ministry. The Qumran settlement was abandoned around 70 CE, so we're talking about 35 years after Jesus died. They abandoned this area. So that's a little bit of the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls, about the Essenes, who were the keepers of that area, the keepers of the library that made up the 11 different caves where they found these documents. Really, really fascinating. If you look into the actual scrolls themselves, you could study your whole lifetime by reading all these different texts and figuring out what they mean and looking at the translations. And I definitely highly recommend you dig into these a little bit more and get into some of the history of each of these individual texts, what they mean, if they were part of the original Old Testament or not, and what they meant to the people at the time and how we translate them today. So let's go ahead and take a look at the video, and we'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
One of the most important archaeological discoveries of the past century, if not of all time, occurred in 1947. Our understanding of the Bible completely changed, and it happened because of a sheep. This amazing discovery happened when a Middle Eastern shepherd found some forgotten-about jars in a forgotten-about cave near the Dead Sea, when, in search for a lost sheep from his flock, took a stone and threw it into a cave and heard the sound of broken pottery. Inside those jars were thousands of parchment scrolls dating back 1,800 years. The significance of the scrolls was initially lost on the people directly associated with them, and the scrolls were purchased by an antiquities dealer who later resold them. A cobbler with an interest in antiques bought a few and in turn sold them to a Syrian Orthodox archbishop for less than $100. In 1954, the archbishop ended up selling those 4 scrolls in the classified ads to Yigael Yadin, an Israeli archaeologist who paid $250,000 for them. Finding the Dead Sea Scrolls marked a significant leap forward in the history of the Bible. They helped to provide evidence and insights into the life of a Jewish community that lived around the time of Jesus. Further, the scrolls represented many examples of biblical scholarship at the time. They also depict the social and political issues of the day, even if scholars still aren't 100% sure who wrote and compiled them. According to the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library, researchers have now sorted the scrolls into several categories and subcategories, and a good portion of the documents are given over to biblical scrolls. We use the word biblical here cautiously because the Bible as a concept didn't exist at the time. The books were just an unofficial collection of documents that were important to the community. Nevertheless, copies of all the Old Testament books, save for the Book of Esther, were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are the oldest known copies in existence, providing a treasure trove for historians and scripture scholars alike. In addition to the biblical scrolls in their original languages are translations into other languages the community would have spoken, such as Aramaic and Greek. Outside of the biblical content, the scrolls contain such things as calendars and commentaries on the scriptures. Copies of books not considered canonical, embellishment of biblical narratives, poetry, and various legal and historical documents related to the community were also included. There were even 15 military letters among the scrolls. The scrolls probably belonged to a Jewish philosophical sect known as the Essenes, a group known for its commitment to sanctity. And the collection of scrolls also contains treasure maps, purportedly guiding the user to hidden caches of gold and silver. So far, none of those treasures have been found. Another fascinating point of interest in the Dead Sea Scrolls was that there were different versions of some of the books in the Old Testament. According to Daniel Falk, professor of classic and ancient Mediterranean studies at Penn State, the books of Exodus, Samuel, Jeremiah, Psalms, and Daniel all had alternate versions. Old Testament scripture varied because it was manually copied and interpreted by different scribes. Even though some view biblical text as hard and fast, through the Dead Sea Scrolls we can see the process by which the ancient stories were recorded and preserved. The scrolls also included previously unknown Jewish religious writings in which the Essenes shared their viewpoints and talked about their disagreements with other Jewish sects. However, according to Falk, there is no mention of Jesus in the scrolls. Rather, it's an insight into the world in which Jesus lived. Professor Falk wrote for the website To The Conversation, both the Essenes and the early Christians believed they were living at the time foretold by prophets when God would establish a kingdom of peace, and that their teacher revealed the true meaning of Scripture. Most importantly, the scrolls help explain why Jesus' teachings and message attracted disciples. It's clear that people were expecting a Messiah.
The Essenes were a Jewish sect. They thrived during the Second Temple period, which was from roughly the 2nd century B.C.E. to the 1st century CE. Known for their mystic beliefs, the Essenes remained shrouded in mystery. They lived apart from mainstream Jewish society. Their practices and beliefs set them apart. The Essenes offer a fascinating glimpse into the diversity of Jewish thought and practice in antiquity. They were seekers of spiritual truth. Their story is one of dedication to a higher calling. The Essenes sought purity and connection with the divine. Their story is interwoven with the tumultuous history of Judea. The Essenes left an indelible mark on the tapestry of religious thought. The origins of the Essenes are debated among historians and scholars. Many scholars place their emergence around the time of Jonathan Apphus, a significant figure in Jewish history. Jonathan Apphus was a Jewish high priest who ruled Judea in the 2nd century B.C.E., a time of great change. This period was marked by intense political and religious turmoil, with various factions vying for power. The Jewish people were grappling with the pervasive influences of Hellenistic culture, which brought new ideas and conflicts. There were significant internal disputes about the interpretation and application of Jewish law, leading to divisions. It was in this context of change, uncertainty, and conflict that the Essenes emerged as a distinct group. They represented a reaction against what they perceived as the corruption and moral decline of the priesthood. The Essenes strongly opposed the Hellenization of Jewish culture, which they saw as a threat to their traditions. They chose a path of strict adherence to their interpretation of the Torah, emphasizing purity and piety. The Essenes retreated from the bustling urban centers, seeking solitude and spiritual purity. They formed their own secluded communities in remote areas, away from the influences they rejected. In these communities, they sought to live in strict accordance with their understanding of God's will, maintaining their unique practices and beliefs. The Essenes were deeply conservative in their interpretation of Jewish law. They adhered to a strict code of conduct. This code governed their daily lives. Central to their beliefs was the concept of ritual purity. The Essenes practiced frequent ritual immersions in water. This was to cleanse themselves from impurities. They emphasized communal living. The Essenes shared their possessions. They ate their meals together. They believed in the importance of celibacy. Some Essenes practiced complete abstinence. Others practiced strict marital regulations. They sought to distance themselves from what they perceived as the decadence of the world.
Much of what we know about the Essenes comes from the writings of ancient historians. I, Josephus, a 1st century CE Jewish historian, provide detailed descriptions of the Essenes. I admired their piety and way of life.
Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher, also wrote about the Essenes. I emphasized their philosophical and theological beliefs.
Pliny the Elder, a Roman naturalist, mentioned the Essenes in my writings. I described their settlement near the Dead Sea.
These accounts, while valuable, offer glimpses into Essene life. They are not without their limitations. They were written from an outsider's perspective. The historians had their own biases and perspectives. Reconstructing a complete picture of the Essenes requires careful analysis of these sources. It also requires consideration of the archaeological evidence. Section 5. Secrets of the Desert, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s revolutionized our understanding of the Essenes, a Jewish sect that lived around the time of Jesus.
These ancient texts were found in caves near the site of Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea, hidden away for nearly 2,000 years.
Scholars believe that the Essenes lived at Qumran, a remote settlement where they could practice their beliefs in isolation.
They likely authored many of the scrolls, meticulously copying and preserving their sacred texts.
The Dead Sea Scrolls contain a wide range of texts, from religious writings to community rules.
There are biblical commentaries, there are legal texts, there are liturgical works, each offering a glimpse into their complex society.
They provide unprecedented insights into the beliefs, practices, and worldview of the Essenes, shedding light on their daily lives and spiritual aspirations.
The scrolls reveal a community deeply concerned with the end of days, reflecting their apocalyptic expectations. They were waiting for the arrival of a Messiah, a savior who would lead them in the final days. They believed in a cosmic battle between good and evil, a struggle that would ultimately determine the fate of the world.
Section 6. A bridge between faiths. Essene influence on Christianity and Mandaism. The Essenes' ideas have sparked debate among scholars for many years. Some suggest that the Essenes may have significantly influenced the development of early Christianity. Both groups shared certain core beliefs and practices. They believed in baptism for the forgiveness of sins and emphasized communal living. They also anticipated a coming Messiah, a savior who would bring about a new era. However, there are also significant differences between the two groups that cannot be overlooked. The Essenes' strict emphasis on the law and ritual purity contrasts sharply with the message of grace and forgiveness found in the teachings of Jesus. Another group that may have been influenced by the Essenes is the Mandaeans, a lesser-known religious sect. They are a Gnostic sect with deep roots in southern Mesopotamia, known for their unique rituals and beliefs. They share some similarities with the Essenes in their beliefs and practices, such as the importance of ritual purity and a focus on esoteric knowledge. However, the precise nature of the relationship between these groups remains unclear, leaving much room for further research and discovery. Section 7. The Vanishing Community. Theories and speculations. The Essenes seem to have disappeared as a distinct group after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. The exact circumstances of their disappearance are unknown. Some scholars speculate that they may have been wiped out during the Roman siege of Jerusalem. Others believe that they may have assimilated into other Jewish groups. Their communities may have simply dissolved gradually over time. The lack of historical evidence makes it difficult to determine their fate with certainty. The Essenes left behind a legacy of mystery. Their story serves as a reminder of the diversity of religious thought and practice in the ancient world. The Essenes' unwavering commitment to their beliefs continues to fascinate and intrigue us today.
So as you can see from the video, there's just so many things to talk about. The first one is you can imagine the painstaking detail and the incredible work that the historians and the archaeologists and the scientists had to do since 1947 until today, and they're still doing today. They're still piecing together these manuscripts, all the incredible number of pieces, putting them together manually, using solutions, using all kinds of different technologies, computers, scanning technology, infrared technology. You see that there's actually technology that's come from the space program that has helped out with this particular project. This is a project many countries are working on, many different scientists, many different societies. Of course, you're also competing against people that are trying to profiteer from the Dead Sea Scrolls. You're talking about groups that are trying to preserve the Dead Sea Scrolls. You're talking about the Jewish and Christian communities that are very nervous about what's going to come out of the Dead Sea Scrolls and whether they're going to undermine their faiths or whether they're going to confirm their faiths that they've always believed in. So just so many fascinating things coming out of the piecing together of this master puzzle from 2,000 years ago. And so I hope you enjoyed that. As you saw in the video, the Essenes were largely believed to be the group that was living there right next to the Dead Sea at Qumran, and that they were the ones who were the most religious of the Judean sects. They believed in the adherence to religion 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. They were incredibly devout. As you saw, they couldn't even enter a religious cave until they had gone through 2 years of intense study. And everything about their lives on a daily basis revolved around their beliefs, their faith, and their Bible, and their overall history and beliefs and culture. So really fascinating to think about the Essenes, about what they had done here with the Dead Sea Scrolls. You heard that those scrolls had been categorized now into 3 different categories. One, the old texts of the Old Testament, of which they have found now all the different books of the Old Testament represented there in the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran. The second category was a set of scrolls that laid out the very strict adherence to daily life that they were expected to do. These were essentially the rules of their daily lives that would be enforced, and there was actually harsh punishment on the Essenes if they didn't abide by those. And then the third category of scrolls they found are more secular in nature, describing what their lives were like, describing the weather, describing more mundane topics that you and me might find in like a daily newspaper today. So 3 different categories, and of course the scientists are interested in all of those. The religious community being interested the most in the biblical texts. The last thing I'd mention there is you see that they've actually been able to prove the dates of the scrolls themselves through carbon dating and through other techniques. They've been able to prove the containers that they used, the clay containers and the scroll jars, by piecing those together and doing other types of both DNA and nuclear tests on those to make sure that they dated back to the time, which they did. And they also have been able to prove that the Essenes put these scroll jars and the scrolls into the jars very hastily, realizing that the Romans were coming and that they needed to hide them in a place that maybe could not be found and could be preserved for future generations, as they prepared, as you saw there, for 200 years for what they knew was coming, which was a future threat to their society or a very large war. They called it the end of days, or the major battle of good and evil. And they really believed that. So they had been preparing for this. Of course, it seems that they lost that battle to the Romans, and the Romans conquered the area, of course. So, but the Romans did not know about the 11 caves. They did not know about the scroll jars and what was in those scroll jars. And so, fortunately for us today, we now have these amazing scrolls that have been discovered, pieced back together, researched, and are still being looked at today to determine what all the meanings of them are. So I hope you enjoyed that program, that you enjoyed the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls, you enjoyed the video, learned a lot about it, and that you want to dig a little bit more into the Dead Sea Scrolls, what's behind them, their meaning, and maybe even study all the different 800 scrolls there are. It would take you quite a while to do so, but it is quite satisfying to figure out what is in each of these 800 scrolls. So please like this video, please subscribe to the channel, and hope you love history as much as we do. And we'll see you next time on Traveling Through History. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.